Welcome to the Roman Empire, where the streets are chaos, the food might kill you, and the most relaxing part of your day is probably a public execution. If you've ever thought that living in ancient times sounded glamorous, think again. In this series, we're going to explore why you wouldn't last a day in Rome. So sit back, relax, preferably not in a Roman bathhouse, and let's dive into a world where even surviving the morning is a monumental achievement. If you were lucky enough to wake up at all in the Roman Empire, you'd probably start your day confused, slightly bruised, and questioning every life decision you'd ever made. The morning of your first day in Rome isn't going to be anything like you expected. No crisp sheets, no fancy coffee maker, and no gentle birds singing outside your window. Instead, expect a chorus of street vendors screaming about fish. A steady drizzle of horse dung falling from the second floor, and the ever-present scent of a city that hasn't figured out the concept of sanitation yet. Let's begin with where you'll be waking up. Your humble abode. In Rome, the wealthy had their grand villas, often perched on hills with views of the Tiber River, lavish fountains, and servants to wipe their brows. You, however, are not wealthy. You live in an insula, which is essentially an ancient version of an apartment complex. But instead of high-rise luxury, think of something more akin to a sardine can that's been overfilled and left out in the sun. These buildings were typically built from wood, stone, and mud bricks, materials that are just perfect for creating fire hazards, unpleasant smells, and walls thin enough to hear your neighbours fighting about the quality of their olive oil. Privacy? Well, that's a quaint idea that hasn't made its way into Roman real estate yet. You share your cramped living space with anyone who can afford a rent-controlled apartment in your block. This isn't the ideal Airbnb you booked. It's more like a rough version of a studio apartment in a city that hasn't quite perfected the art of plumbing or hygiene. You'll wake up in the dark because Roman windows are just big holes in the wall covered with wooden shutters. No curtains, no cosy morning light, just a literal hole in the wall. Maybe you've heard that Romans invented glass, but they certainly didn't think it was necessary for their living arrangements. The sun hasn't fully risen yet, but don't worry, you won't need an alarm clock. You'll be woken up by the gentle sound of chariot wheels clattering outside your window, a horse probably giving birth just a few feet away from your bed, and street vendors shouting their wares at 5 a.m. because they definitely know how to start the day right. Oh, and the delightful cacophony of people using the public latrine. It's a smell, it's an experience. Mostly it's something you'll regret signing up for. Now that you've woken up, let's talk about your morning routine, if you can even call it that. You stumble out of your bed, which, by the way, consists of a few thin blankets thrown on a wooden platform with little to no support. And you're already feeling the effects of the Roman mattress, more like a medieval torture device designed to keep you awake. But hey, at least it's better than sleeping on the floor, sort of. You stagger out of your room and into the common area, where you find your fellow insular dwellers trying to pretend that their lives aren't entirely made of struggle and despair. Your roommate, a farmer by the looks of it, has already started his day by dousing himself in olive oil. because personal hygiene in the Roman world wasn't exactly modern. You see, the Romans thought that oil was the answer to everything, whether it was skin care or cleaning your body. And since you don't exactly have access to running water or showers, oiling yourself up is the next best thing. So, while you're figuring out what your version of getting clean looks like, don't forget that you have an oil slick glistening on your skin. And it's only 6 a.m. Now it's time to get dressed. You've heard that the toga is the Roman equivalent of modern business casual, and you're thrilled at the prospect of looking important. But as you start to wrap yourself in the folds of your toga, you realise that there's no way to do this without turning into a giant fabric burrito that makes no sense at all. The more you try, the more you feel like an overcooked lasagna. And by the time you're done, you've likely become a human attempt at fashion that only the gods could understand. You give up and leave the house in your poorly draped toga, already sweating more than you thought possible for 7 a.m, and unsure of whether you've managed to look like a dignified Roman citizen or the unfortunate result of an ancient costume malfunction. Let's talk about the bathroom situation, shall we? Because it's not like you're stepping out into a modern private restroom with plumbing and soap. No, you've been tasked with finding the nearest public latrine, which, by the way, has been used by everyone from wealthy senators to that guy who just wants to sell you fish at an alarmingly early hour. These Roman bathrooms weren't the serene, sparkling clean restrooms you see in glossy magazine ads. They were more like long stone benches with holes in them, and the only thing between you and your fellow Romans was a shared wooden stick that you'd use to wipe yourself. That's right, there's no toilet paper. And it's not like you can hold it in, because you've been eating grains and questionable meats your whole life, and your digestive system is already revolting against you. But don't worry, it gets worse. There are no real sinks to wash your hands, and certainly no antibacterial wipes. You're lucky if you find a sponge on a stick to clean up after yourself. The whole experience is more like a communal event. Everyone's there, everyone's in a hurry, and no one is talking about it. It's really the perfect way to start your morning, don't you think? You survive the morning ritual, barely avoiding any public confrontations about your toga's poor form, and begin your day by exiting your humble abode and heading into the streets. This is where things go from bad to worse. The Romans may have perfected the art of road building, but that doesn't mean you'll enjoy walking through the city. The roads are stone paved and built for military chariots, not pedestrians who weren't born with sturdy ankles. The streets are filled with so much mud and debris that stepping out in sandals feels like an invitation for disaster. It's like walking through a field of Legos, except there's a chariot barreling toward you and a donkey nearby, who is 100% likely to relieve itself in your path. Navigating the streets of Rome is an adventure in itself, and you'll quickly realise that the concept of sidewalks hasn't yet reached Rome. You'll be dodging traffic, stepping into puddles, and trying not to be squashed by an unpredictable chariot race. There's no public transportation, so if you want to get anywhere, you'll have to either walk like a gladiator preparing for a fight, or awkwardly stumble your way through the crowds like a clueless tourist. At this point, if you're still alive, you're starting to realise that the Roman Empire is not exactly the place you want to spend an extended vacation. It's only the morning, and you've already had your fill of ancient Roman inconveniences. But don't worry, you'll be fine. After all, you haven't even gotten to the public baths yet, and that's where the real adventure begins. So, as you make your way through the streets of Rome, wondering how you've managed to survive this long without dying of frustration, remember that things are just getting started. Welcome to the city where the ground is made of stone, the air smells like every animal and human ever, and you're just trying not to get run over by a chariot. Surviving the streets, getting around Rome without getting stabbed. If you thought surviving the morning in ancient Rome was a challenge, just wait until you try to leave your insula. It's time to venture out into the streets, where getting from point A to point B requires more skill, luck, and sheer audacity than any Roman had the decency to warn you about. You step outside, and the first thing you notice is that Rome is loud. The city is alive in a way that modern cities can't quite match. Constant noise, endless shouting, and the occasional sound of something breaking. Vendors are already setting up their stalls, shouting about fish that have probably been left out in the sun for far too long. You'd think they'd be more concerned about the lack of refrigeration. But no, this is Rome, where everything is fresh, for as long as it can be mistaken for fresh. So, if you're not already regretting your life choices, you will be soon. As you begin to step forward, it becomes clear that Rome is not designed for pedestrians. The streets, if you can even call them streets, are cobbled with rough stone, which means walking anywhere requires constant vigilance. You're not exactly gliding through the streets in comfort. Instead, you're dodging uneven stones that seem to take pleasure in tripping you up, while your sandals, sturdy and reliable for about 12 seconds, are already covered in grime from the overflowing gutters. The drainage system? Oh, don't worry about it. Just walk carefully and hope that your feet don't touch anything unpleasant. And by unpleasant, I mean the literal rivers of waste that snake through the streets like modern-day water features. Only far smellier and much, much less Instagrammable. As you venture deeper into the urban jungle, you'll notice the traffic. And by traffic, I mean an all-out gladiatorial battle between pedestrians, chariots, carts, and the occasional mule. It's a miracle anyone gets anywhere without being flattened by a chariot. The streets of Rome are busy all day, with the constant rumble of wheels against stone, horses galloping past, and the sound of people arguing about whether or not they should sell you those rotten figs you've been eyeing. In fact, the Romans were so good at creating traffic congestion that it's said they were the first civilization to truly understand the fine art of blocking intersections. Navigating these streets feels like a game of dodgeball, except the balls are made of stone, and if they hit you, you're probably dead. Chariots speed by with barely enough room for you to squeeze through, leaving you to wonder how it's even possible for so many people to live in such a small, chaotic space. Good luck crossing the street without getting run over. There's no designated pedestrian crossing. No, in Rome, you just kind of have to hope you can make it across the road before a horse-drawn cart decides to turn you into a new urban legend. And while we're on the topic of getting run over, let us talk about the animals. Rome, unlike modern cities where stray dogs are a nuisance, was essentially a zoo with no zookeeper. Dogs, pigs, goats and, if you're really unlucky, cattle roam the streets, often contributing to the public mess in more ways than one. Picture this. You're trying to get to the market, weaving through crowds of people, and suddenly a goat decides that your toga is the perfect thing to nibble on. Or maybe a donkey blocks the street just long enough for you to realise you've been standing next to it for a little too long. But you can't just walk away, because that would be considered rude in Roman society, and we wouldn't want to offend the donkey. Oh, and don't forget the pigeons. While we think of pigeons as annoying flying rats, in Rome they were a part of the urban ecosystem. The problem is that no one in ancient Rome ever bothered to do anything about them. You'll find pigeons perched on everything: statues, buildings, and, most infuriatingly, on the bread you just bought. That's right, even your food isn't safe in Rome. You'll spend your day trying to avoid pigeon droppings, while also steering clear of the most unfortunate smells known to humanity. Not that it matters much. You've already lost the battle against the smell of public latrines wafting through the air. Speaking of smells, let's dive into the odours. Every city has a scent, but Rome has perfected the art of mixing scents no one ever wanted together. The stench of human waste, animal droppings, and stagnant water all combine to create a unique atmosphere you will come to associate with Rome. This is not the charming old world smell you might read about in travel guides. This is the scent of centuries of poor sanitation and too many people in one place. The air is thick with a smell so powerful you might mistake it for the scent of despair. It's almost as if the city itself is daring you to survive. At this point, you might be asking yourself, what about the markets? Well, let's just say the markets of Rome aren't quite as charming as the ones you see in travel documentaries. Sure, there's fresh produce, which is always questionable, pottery that might explode the minute you touch it, and clothes that will likely give you an allergic reaction. But good luck trying to make your way through these crowds. The streets are filled with merchants peddling their goods, each one shouting louder than the last. If you're not careful, you could easily end up being sold something you didn't need or want. And no, you can't just return it. This isn't Amazon, it's ancient Rome. Once you've bought that authentic Roman pottery, you're stuck with it. Just pray it doesn't fall apart before you get back to your insula. But let's not forget the threat of violence. After all, you're not exactly in the safest place on earth. Romans had a peculiar relationship with violence. It was more like an Olympic sport than a last resort. Getting into a street brawl was just part of Roman life. Disagreements were often settled by sword fights, yelling matches, or an impromptu gladiatorial combat. So, as you make your way through the crowds, you'll need to be on high alert. Someone might bump into you, and just like that, you're being dragged into a confrontation that might end in a duel, or worse, a public execution. Which, by the way, is an event where you definitely don't want to be a spectator, but you're going to end up one anyway. And just when you think it can't get worse, you realise that getting robbed is practically a rite of passage in ancient Rome. With pickpockets everywhere and thieves who are shockingly good at their jobs, you'll have to keep a tight grip on your purse, or risk losing your hard-earned denarii. The streets are filled with people who would just as soon relieve you of your valuables as look at you. If you're lucky, the thief might let you keep your sandals, but don't count on it. As you continue to walk the streets, now thoroughly convinced that Rome is a death trap, It's time to acknowledge the most inconvenient truth of all. There's no escape. The city stretches on forever, and every street leads to another street, which leads to another market, which leads to another gladiator ready to give you a piece of his mind and his sword. You'll wonder, with every step, why you thought this was a good idea in the first place. Maybe the ancient Romans were just better suited to their chaotic world, because after spending even a few hours in their shoes, you're ready to pack it all in and go back to your comfortable, safe home, where you can at least avoid the ever-present threat of being trampled by a chariot. At this point, you've survived the streets of Rome, but things aren't over yet. You're probably questioning your life choices, but don't worry, it's only going to get more complicated. Next, you'll experience the Roman bathhouse, a place that's supposed to be a relaxing experience, but might leave you questioning why you thought it was a good idea to get clean in the first place. The public bathhouse, Roman hygiene, and why you're probably going to catch something. Welcome to the Roman bathhouse, where cleanliness is next to, well, something, but it's definitely not health. If you thought surviving the streets of Rome was a challenge, prepare to meet your next great enemy, the bathhouse. Here's the deal. Every Roman, regardless of status, had access to the public baths. They were places to cleanse both the body and the soul, and by cleanse we mean wash off the grime of the day and maybe pick up a deadly infection or two. But don't let the word bath fool you. The Roman bathhouse wasn't some tranquil spa with fluffy towels and cucumber water. No, no, no. It was more like a health code violation waiting to happen. A steam room full of sweaty bodies, oil-slicked skin, and an assortment of bacteria that could only dream of making it into modern textbooks. The bathhouse was the place to be for socializing, gossiping, and potentially contracting something that would definitely end your day or your life, depending on how lucky you were. So here you are. It's time to experience the public bath in all its glory. Let's break it down step by step as you awkwardly navigate your way through this ancient Roman ritual, praying that you don't get more than you bargained for. Step 1. Entering the bathhouse, where your problems begin. As you approach the bathhouse, your first thought is, how bad can it be? You've survived the streets of Rome, dodging chariots, goats, and pigeon droppings, and you've survived a morning in your cramped insula. Surely the bathhouse will be the one place in this city where things will be somewhat civilized. Unfortunately, you would be wrong. The bathhouse is, for all intents and purposes, a public spa, but one that involves communal nudity and the constant risk of disease. You enter the building through a massive arched doorway that smells faintly of burnt incense and body odour. Inside, the temperature hits you like a wall. It's a warm, moist environment that's somehow both suffocating and oddly welcoming if you have a severe disregard for personal space, hygiene, and basic human decency. Once inside, you realise that modesty is something reserved for the poor or the very, very rich. The rest of Rome, completely fine with dropping their clothes and diving into a pool of shared sweat. In fact, the idea of walking around fully clothed would probably get you a few weird looks. This is the Roman Empire after all. So, you grudgingly begin the process of disrobing, wondering if you've made a terrible mistake. But there's no turning back now. As you undress, you notice that you're surrounded by the most unflattering human form imaginable. Everyone around you is in various stages of undress, and if you thought your toga made you look ridiculous, wait until you see the assortment of Romans walking around in their birthday suits. There's the old man with an unfortunate amount of sagging skin, the younger man who looks like he's been lifting weights, and then there's the kid who's far too excited about being here and thinks that standing in front of a mirror flexing is somehow a valid use of his time. You may also notice the mild aroma of body oils, sweat, and whatever aromatherapy the Romans tried to pass off as fresh. Don't worry though, everyone else smells just as bad, so you're all in this together. Step 2. The bathing process. Prepare to be uncomfortable. Once you've managed to slip into the steaming room, you'll quickly realise that bathing in ancient Rome is not exactly the relaxing, meditative experience you imagined. First, the temperature of the water is hotter than you're used to, way hotter. It's essentially like stepping into a hot tub on steroids. The Romans believed in the therapeutic value of extreme temperatures, which meant that the water is scalding enough to make you question your life choices, but not quite hot enough to kill you on the spot. Just think of it as an experience designed to really test your threshold for pain. You're supposed to start by entering the caldarium, the hot room, which is a chamber that has an almost oppressive heat designed to make you sweat out all your worldly troubles. You lie there on a stone bench, trying to distract yourself from the fact that you're covered in sweat, and a man next to you is performing some sort of strange, oily ritual with his body. As he rubs himself down with olive oil, which was the Romans' version of body lotion, you're left wondering if there's any chance of you being able to leave this experience without catching whatever strange skin condition he's trying to cure. But before you get too comfortable, it's time to move on to the next part of the experience, the tepidarium, the warm room. This room is a welcome change, with a temperature that's slightly less painful than the caldarium, but still rather uncomfortable. It's the kind of warm that makes you question whether it's worth it to stay or just go home, lock your door, and never speak of this again. But you don't leave, because Romans don't leave, they stay, they chat, they gossip. You're now part of the social fabric of the Roman bathhouse. You'll learn about everything from the price of grain in Gaul to the latest scandal in the Senate, all while trying not to make eye contact with the person standing a little too close to you. Oh, and did I mention that the bathhouse is also a public space for all classes of people? That means you'll be sharing the experience with slaves, wealthy senators, and everyone in between. Nothing says community quite like an awkward situation where you're surrounded by people whose social status is as clear as the steam rising around you. Step 3. Scraping off the dirt more than you bargained for. Once you've gotten over the initial shock of communal bathing and questionable conversations, you'll be escorted to the strigil, an ancient Roman tool designed to scrape the sweat, oil, and grime off your body. The strigil looks like a curved metal spoon, and it's exactly as delightful as it sounds. This is where things get truly weird. The Romans weren't exactly into scrubbing with soap. Instead, they rubbed themselves down with oil and then scraped it off with the strigil. Imagine applying oil to your skin and then trying to get rid of it by scraping it off with a tool that looks like it was designed for medieval torture. This process is painful and leaves you feeling like someone just rubbed you down with sandpaper. But it's not just the process that's strange, it's the social dynamic. While you're being scraped down by some strange man or woman with a strigil, you'll notice that everyone is doing it. This isn't a private experience. It's a communal event. Everyone's in it together, trying to get clean, but also getting more and more uncomfortable by the minute. As you try to get the oil off, you'll notice that the person next to you is doing the same thing, with far too much enthusiasm for your liking. Step 4. The real threat, germs, disease, and all the fun stuff. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, maybe it's not so bad. I've survived the caldarium and the strigil. What could go wrong? Well, let me answer that question for you. Bacteria. The ancient Romans, despite their many accomplishments, didn't quite get the concept of germs. The bathhouses were germ factories, steaming hot, full of sweaty bodies, and zero awareness of sanitation. It's entirely possible that you've just contracted a few diseases, or at the very least, have encountered something that will make you wish you'd stayed in bed for the rest of your life. While the Romans were fairly obsessed with cleanliness in certain ways, they were also blissfully unaware of how easily diseases spread in places like this. After all, what's more fun than sharing a public bath with hundreds of people, all of whom are carrying germs, lice, and the occasional plague? The fact that you're still alive to question your decisions is nothing short of miraculous. And as for that lovely communal sponge on a stick used for wiping yourself down, let's just say it's not as hygienic as it sounds. The same sponge is used by everyone, which, surprise, surprise, leads to the spread of skin diseases and other more unpleasant ailments. If you thought you could catch something from a public pool today, imagine the kind of bacterial buffet that existed in Roman baths. It's the perfect environment for every kind of skin condition and respiratory illness you can't pronounce. Step 5. Wrapping it up, a social event you'll never forget. After you've been scrubbed down, scraped, and possibly infected with something you'll spend the next few weeks ignoring, you'll make your way out of the bathhouse, feeling slightly more disgusting than when you walked in. But hey, at least your skin is shiny, probably from all the oil, sweat, and bacteria you've accumulated. You're not sure if you've achieved true cleanliness, but you're definitely more uncomfortable than when you started. You leave the bathhouse, your skin tingling from a mixture of oil, sweat, and whatever that sticky substance was that was on your towel, thinking that never again will you make the mistake of trying to participate in this ancient form of hygiene. But as you step outside, you realise you've been in Rome long enough to know that there's no such thing as clean. Not really, now that you've survived the bathhouse and all the unsanitary joy it offers. It's time to venture out into the next level of Roman entertainment. You've experienced the chaos of public bathing, but the real test will be surviving the gladiatorial games, a public spectacle where the audience cheers for bloodshed. Dining in Rome, why you'd starve, or probably poison yourself. By now, if you've made it this far, you might be thinking to yourself, sure, ancient Rome is a total disaster, but at least they have food, right? And to that I say, well, yes, they do have food, sort of. Rome was an empire built on excess, where the wealthy feasted like they were trying to win a gold medal in gluttony, while the poor were left to subsist on what can only be described as medieval excuses for meals. But as for you, well, trying to dine in Rome as a commoner, or anyone really, is a test of both your survival skills and your stomach's fortitude. Let's break down the delightful experience of dining in ancient Rome and explore why, if you somehow found yourself in a Roman dinner party, you'd probably either starve to death, get food poisoning, or, if you're lucky, just go home and never speak of it again. First of all, let's get one thing straight. Roman food wasn't all that glamorous, and certainly not the Instagram-worthy feasts you might imagine. The wealthy may have had access to vast arrays of exotic meats, delicacies from across the empire, and courses that stretched on for hours. But you, dear time traveller, are not wealthy. You are you, and your chances of being invited to one of those lavish feasts are about as slim as your chances of surviving a gladiatorial contest. In fact, you're more likely to find yourself at a humble Roman street food stall, where the options include items like gruel, porridge, and stale bread. Bon appetit. The Romans didn't have access to the modern convenience of refrigerators or microwave ovens, so the quality of their food was a constant gamble. If it was fresh, great, but considering the lack of proper refrigeration, it was more often than not a case of eat it now or regret it later. Even wealthy Romans had to deal with food that could spoil faster than a hot dog at a summer picnic. You'll be lucky if the fish didn't arrive 2 days too late, because fresh fish wasn't exactly a thing when it came to Roman cuisine. So what exactly are we working with here? Well, the basic Roman diet for the common folk consisted of bread, gruel, olives, and cheese. That's it. You're living on carbs, dairy, and things that look suspiciously like they were left out on the counter for 3 days. Sure, the wealthy had roasted meats, exotic fruits, and even wild boar, but for the common Roman, meals were about survival, not indulgence. And by survival I mean fending off hunger while praying you don't catch something awful from your food. Let's say you've somehow managed to get invited to a proper Roman banquet. Congratulations, you've made it to the big leagues. You walk into the lavish dining room excited about the prospect of fine food, and then, bam, you're hit with the harsh reality of Roman dining. First off, let's talk about how meals are served. Roman meals were typically laid out buffet style, which sounds nice in theory. However, you'll quickly notice that the buffet doesn't exactly feature things like serving spoons or even plates. Instead, it's all about grabbing food with your hands, which is not the best situation considering how much of the food looks like it's been left out under the hot Roman sun for a few days too long. Let's dive into the courses you'll likely encounter. First, you'll be presented with a starter. Things like boiled eggs, sardines, and more olives. As you stare at the odd combination of food in front of you, you'll wonder, is this meant to be an appetizer, or just a cruel joke from the hosts? You're pretty sure you're being set up for something, but since it's either this, or wander the streets of Rome eating stale bread and hoping to find a stray goat, you go for it. Big mistake. Next comes the main course, which, depending on how wealthy your host is, could be anything from boiled cabbage to roast pork to wild game. That's right. If you're lucky enough to be in a well-to-do Roman's house, you might get to taste roast peacock. Because why eat chicken when you can pretend you're royalty? Of course, there's a catch. If you're not in the elite class, your main course will probably be a stew of some kind, made with whatever scraps the kitchen had left over. There might even be dried fruit thrown in for flavour, which sounds like a great idea in theory until you realise you're eating a stew of mystery meat and chewy raisins. Delicious, right? But what really seals the deal is the Roman seasoning. The Romans were obsessed with garum, a fermented fish sauce so pungent it could knock your socks off. Garum was added to almost every dish: meat, fish, vegetables, even desserts. Yes, desserts. In fact, nothing says fine dining like a hearty serving of garum-covered figs. So, as you sit down to enjoy your meal, keep in mind that there's a good chance your stomach will either reject it outright or your taste buds will file a formal complaint with the Roman authorities. Either way, you're going to have a memorable dining experience, just not the kind you were hoping for. If the food isn't enough to make you reconsider your life choices, the Roman drinks will do the trick. Romans, like many ancient civilizations, didn't have the luxury of nice, cold bottles of water at their disposal. Instead, they drank a concoction called posca, a diluted vinegar drink often flavoured with herbs. Yes, that's right, vinegar. If you've ever mistakenly taken a swig of vinegar thinking it was something else, you know exactly what to expect. The Romans, for reasons known only to them, thought this was the perfect drink to pair with everything. So, imagine sitting down to your meal and sipping on vinegar-flavoured water while trying not to gag on the odd combination of garum-drenched stew and soggy bread. Enjoy! Now, if you're wealthy, or just feeling adventurous, you might get to drink wine. However, it's not the fine, aged stuff you're imagining. No, Roman wine was often diluted with water, and sometimes honey, to mask the fact that it was usually bitter and nasty. To make things even more interesting, Romans didn't always have the best sanitation practices, so it's possible that the wine you're sipping was contaminated with who knows what. If you're lucky, you'll just end up with a headache and an overwhelming sense of regret. If you're unlucky, well, food poisoning is always an option. After making it through a main course that's more about survival than enjoyment, you're finally treated to dessert, or so you think. In ancient Rome, desserts weren't exactly what we'd consider sweet. You won't find any cheesecake, chocolate cake, or cupcakes here. No, the Romans had a very different idea of what should satisfy a sweet tooth. Your dessert options might include figs stuffed with nuts, honey cakes, or sweetened cheese. But the real kicker? Fruit. Because nothing says dessert like the prickly pear, which sounds like something you'd find on a farmer's market table, but ends up being something you eat only because you're too polite to refuse. And of course, you can't forget the ever-present garum, just in case you forgot what it tasted like during the main course. The Romans decided to put it on your dessert too. Delicious! At this point, you've experienced the full range of Roman dining. You've eaten your way through stale bread, dubious meat, garum-soaked vegetables, and way too much wine. As you sit back, feeling bloated and nauseous, you realise that there's a strong chance you might not make it out of this dinner alive. Food poisoning was rampant in ancient Rome, thanks to their lack of refrigeration, sanitation, and basic understanding of hygiene. So while you might not die from a gladiatorial sword wound, you might just fall victim to dining out in Rome. The best case scenario? You wake up with a headache, a stomachache, and a deep, profound regret for ever thinking ancient Rome had anything even remotely resembling good food. So, after your death-defying dining experience, you've come to the conclusion that surviving a Roman meal is an Olympic event in itself. You've made it through the gruel, the suspicious meats, and the garum-drenched monstrosities. And you're still standing, barely, but don't get too comfortable just yet. As if surviving the Roman food scene wasn't enough, it's time to face the ultimate test of your endurance in the Empire, the gladiatorial games. In the next part, we'll dive headfirst into the world of bloodshed, swords, and wild animals, where the only certainty is that you'll probably be dead within minutes, but at least you won't have to deal with that vinegary drink again. The Roman army and why you'd last approximately 5 minutes as a soldier. Congratulations, traveller. You've made it this far, and by some miracle, you're still alive despite the Colosseum-like feasts, garum-coated horrors, and an abundance of dubious public hygiene. But here's the thing. Ancient Rome isn't done with you yet. As a last test of your survival skills, we now bring you to one of the most terrifying institutions of the Empire, the Roman army. If you thought surviving the food was bad, just wait until you see how the Romans treated their soldiers. In the army, there was no room for the weak, the lazy, or anyone who preferred the comforts of their own bed. No, the Roman legions were made up of tough, relentless soldiers, and you wouldn't last a day, not even 5 minutes. But don't worry, I'll explain why. First things first, let's talk about how you end up in the Roman army. Now, in the modern world, signing up for military service might involve a few background checks, a physical, and some forms you have to fill out while silently questioning your life choices. But in ancient Rome, the process was far less bureaucratic and far more brutal. Imagine waking up one day in the middle of a busy street in ancient Rome, only to find yourself surrounded by armed men in sandals. The next thing you know, you've been drafted into the Roman army. No questions asked, no second chances. If you were of military age and able-bodied, congratulations, you were a soldier now. And by able-bodied, we mean you could walk without assistance and had a pulse. Here's the catch, Rome was a republic, at least in its earlier years, and the army needed more recruits than they could count. So, citizens were drafted without much say in the matter. You weren't joining the army because you wanted to protect your country, or because it looked like a good way to get health benefits. You joined because it was either that or the Romans would drag you off the street and force you to march into battle without so much as a hello first. If you're thinking, sure, that sounds uncomfortable, but I'll get through it. Just wait until you see what happens next. Now that you've somehow been conscripted into the army, it's time for your training. And by training, I mean a non-stop, brutal, soul-crushing experience designed to break you physically, mentally, and emotionally. You'll quickly learn that the Roman soldiers were not your typical weekend warriors, lacing up a pair of sneakers to jog around the block. Oh no, the Romans were professional soldiers, and they wanted to make sure you were ready to fight at any moment. Imagine the worst boot camp experience you can think of. Now multiply that by about 10,000. Roman recruits didn't just spend a few weeks running laps and doing push-ups. They were subjected to years of grueling training, all under the watchful eyes of disciplinarians who made drill sergeants look like cuddly teddy bears. You think the physical demands are tough? Well, buckle up. Roman recruits had to march over 20 miles a day with heavy armour, around 45, 70 pounds of metal, strapped to their bodies. Think about that for a second. 20 miles. In sandals. With armour. You'd probably make it about 5 steps before realising your feet had become unrecognisable lumps of raw meat. But keep going, because the Roman army had a motto. You're a soldier, not a human being. To make matters worse, your training involved swordplay and fighting tactics, all conducted with real weapons. There's nothing like the feeling of real swords cutting through the air as you try and fail to keep up with your fellow soldiers, who have been practicing since they were old enough to walk. You've never held a sword, and you can barely walk without tripping over your own sandals, let alone defend yourself against a battle-hardened Roman veteran. But don't worry, the punishment for failure: more training. And possibly a whipping for good measure. Now that you've survived the hellish training, or you've dropped out by pretending to have an injury that absolutely no one believes, let's talk about your equipment. The Roman army wasn't a place where you could bring your own gear or pick out what felt comfortable. No, the army issued equipment was carefully selected for you. And by carefully selected, I mean that the Romans chose the heaviest, most uncomfortable things imaginable and made you wear them. First, there's the lorica segmentata, the Roman armour that, while impressive in its appearance, was cumbersome as all get out. It was made of metal strips, and it weighed about 20-30 pounds, which means you could expect to feel like a human tank for the entirety of your service. This armour didn't exactly offer comfort or mobility, and after a few hours of wearing it, you'd probably be praying for sweet release. But no, you'll march another 15 miles, because that's what Romans do. And then there's the scutum, the massive rectangular shield that weighs about the same as a small child. You're supposed to hold it up during battle, but after about 5 minutes, your arms will feel like they've been replaced with burning piles of spaghetti. Meanwhile, your fellow soldiers are marching like it's nothing, because they've been doing this since childhood and are now walking iron walls. Don't forget your gladius, the short sword every Roman soldier carried, which looks terrifying in theory, but in reality weighs down your belt like a brick in a bag. The worst part? You'll never get a chance to use it properly, because you'll be too busy collapsing from exhaustion to even remember that you're supposed to be protecting Rome. Let's talk about marching. The Roman legions were known for their remarkable endurance. While you're sitting on your couch eating snacks, thinking about how hard your life is, the Roman army is out there, marching over 20 miles a day, carrying armour, shields, swords, and their dignity, which you can forget about once you start your trek. You think you've walked a lot? Sure, you've gone to the mall a few times, maybe hiked a mountain or two, but try walking 20 miles every single day while carrying a ton of metal on your body, plus your pack. Inside your pack are things like rations, a tent, tools, and spare shoes, because after a day of marching, you'll probably need them. Your feet, which were once your pride and joy, will quickly turn into mangled lumps of flesh after walking across rough terrain in sandals, a world away from the cushy shoes you're used to. And heaven forbid you trip. You'll fall behind, and discipline in the Roman army was swift and painful. You'd either be forced to keep up or be left for dead. This is not the time for the blisters, are just a minor inconvenience mentality. In fact, you'd probably be lucky if you managed to make it through 5 minutes of marching before a blister outbreak sent you straight to the nearest Roman medic, who, let's be honest, wasn't going to help much. Now we come to the final test, the battlefield. Imagine everything you've endured so far: training, equipment, marching, and now it's time to face your enemies. You've never fought in a real battle before, and your only experience with swords is pretending to wield one in your backyard when you were 8. But hey, maybe you'll be fine, right? It's not like the Romans are all well-practiced, bloodthirsty killing machines. Oh wait, they are. As soon as you step onto the battlefield, you'll find that the Romans were perfectionists when it came to warfare. They knew how to fight in tight formations, strategically and ruthlessly. The battlefield for you will feel like a nightmare of clashing metal, roaring soldiers, and people trying to stab you with swords, all while your legs buckle from exhaustion. You'll last about 5 minutes, if that. The Roman soldiers? They'll be fine. They've been trained for this exact moment their entire lives. Meanwhile, you'll probably trip over your own shield, get hit in the face by a stray arrow, or just collapse from pure mental exhaustion. The Romans didn't take prisoners, so you'll probably die. But at least it'll be quick, so there you have it. From the moment you're dragged into service to the instant you're sent to the front lines to face a brutal death, you'll quickly realise that the Roman army isn't exactly a place where you want to be. But hey, at least you won't have to worry about food poisoning, right?